We have early accounts or early reports that Jesus rose from the dead. In other words, reports that go right back to the beginning. So I used to think, like a lot of skeptics, that the resurrection was a legend. And I knew it took time for legend to develop in the ancient world, so I figured, 100, 150 years after the death of Jesus, legends developed, mythologies were spun, stories were invented, and that's where the idea of the resurrection came from. What I've learned, I think, decimates the claim that the resurrection is a legend. And here's why. We have preserved for us a creed of the earliest Christians. A creed, a statement of conviction based on eyewitness accounts that the earliest Christians right there in the first century would rally around based on facts that they knew to be true. So this creed contains the essence of Christianity. It says Jesus died. Why? For our sins. He was buried. On the third day, he rose from the dead. And then it mentions the specific names of eyewitnesses and groups of eyewitnesses to whom he appeared, including 500 people at once. And then it says parenthetically, by the way, a lot of those folks are still around. So if you don't believe me, go ask them. Go ahead and talk to them yourself. Right. If they're around, you can question them. Now, this creed has been dated back by scholars to within months of the death of Jesus. How do we know? Well, the Apostle Paul preserved it for us. He wrote a letter to the church in Corinth about 21 to 25 years after the death of Jesus. He recounts this creed, and he indicates past tense. I already gave you this creed earlier. So let's say within 20 years, he had given this creed to the church in Corinth. We could stop there, and that would be very impressive when you consider the first two biographies of Alexander the Great by Arrian and Plutarch, written 400 years after his life, and they're generally considered reliable. So within 20 years is really good, but we can go back earlier, because we know that Paul used to be Saul of Tarsus, a persecutor, a hater of Christians. 1 to 3 years after the death of Jesus, he's on the road to Damascus. Boom, he has this encounter with the risen Christ. He becomes the Apostle Paul. Immediately, he goes into Damascus and he meets with some apostles. Now, many scholars believe this is when he was given the creed that he later writes in the letter. But others say, wait, it may have been 3 years later. 3 years later, Paul goes to Jerusalem and he meets for 15 days with two eyewitnesses to the resurrection who are specifically named in the creed, Peter and James. And the Greek word that Paul uses in Galatians to describe this meeting suggests that this was an investigative inquiry. They were checking each other out. What do you know? What did you see? What did you experience? And some scholars believe this is when he was given the creed by two people specifically named in the creed. Wow. But either way, this means within 1 to 6 years after the death of Jesus, this creed is already in existence, and therefore the beliefs that make up that creed go back earlier, virtually to the cross itself. In fact, probably the greatest scholar in this area, Dr. James D.G. Dunn, says, this is a quote, he says, this tradition, by that he means this creed, we can be entirely confident, was formulated as a creed, as tradition, within months of the death of Jesus.